Everyone. My name is Nick Westcott. I'm the director of the Royal African Society. While people are still coming in to join us, the participants, I'll just say a few words by way of introduction because we only have an hour and I'm keenly give as much opportunity for people to ask questions about a distinguished panel as possible. This is a briefing on climate and conflict in Africa. Will COP26 make a difference? And it's being organized by the Royal African Society under the auspices of the APPG, and I'm very pleased we will have 1 or 2 parliamentarians joining us today as well, and that will enliven the discussion. But it derives from a conference that the Royal African Society organized jointly with Africa Confidential and the International Crisis Group in September, before COP26, deliberately to give a platform for African voices and draw some conclusions in relation to where Africa sits, what Africa's interests are, what Africa's opinions were on these climate issues, and the context from which it came. And that conference which was very well attended. We had about 1,000 people globally joining, and headliners like Vice President of Nigeria, a very distinguished cast of African participants. But it reached 4 broad conclusions, which we then fed into the COP process afterwards. Firstly, it identified that climate change was already exacerbating conflict in parts of Africa. It wasn't necessarily causing conflict, but it was definitely exacerbating it, in many cases, making it harder to find resolutions, as well as harder to take action to combat climate change in these areas. Secondly, it recognized that we needed to measure the impact better, because at the moment there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but not enough hard evidence that enabled African governments to go and say, this is what is happening because of climate change, this is why we need to arrest global warming as swiftly as possible. The third conclusion was that actually the top priority is to do exactly that, to reduce and reverse the accumulation of greenhouse gases because it is having this immediate impact right now in Africa. And that was the top priority, we believe, for Africa's negotiators. But fourthly, nevertheless, the money is important. And therefore, the Western countries, developed countries, needed to meet their commitments to provide mitigation and adaptation finance. But equally important was how this would be spent. And in particular, we identified that African governments themselves had more to do, both to join up their own policies on climate change with other policies of the government, defense, security, energy, finance. All those needed to be integrated in policy terms. And there needed to be more devoted, in particular, to the energy transition, to education for climate change, because we need people with the skills to manage the adaptation and mitigation measures. And thirdly, conservation of the biodiversity in which Africa is so rich. And we communicated this message publicly and privately. We passed it to government negotiators, both African and the chair, British government, and we amongst ourselves addressed a number of fringe meetings during COP26 to make sure that those messages were passed across there as well. I'm delighted to be joined today by the 2 co-hosts of that conference. Patrick Smith, who is the renowned editor of Africa Confidential. Few people know as much about Africa as Patrick, and he is going to talk a bit about what happened at COP26 and how this is impacting on Africa. And secondly, Dr. Comfort Ero, acting Vice President of the International Crisis Group and also Director of their Africa program for many years, who will be looking at how this is impacting already on the ground and how that's affecting the political and economic dynamics there. So I'm delighted to welcome all of you participating. If you have any comments or questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom. That's what we'll be looking at ourselves to pull in the questions. Questions are very welcome. We'll have some brief introductory statements, but then plenty of time for questions and answers, I hope. And please use the Q&A, and we will then pick up those. If it's feasible to bring you in to ask them yourselves, we will, but otherwise I'll relay them to our panelists. So thank you very much. And Patrick, can I turn to you first to give us a quick heads up on how things went at COP and what it means for Africa? Over to you.
Many thanks, Nick. I am, as in many things, I'm a bit of a fraud on this because I'm dependent totally on our correspondent who was at COP, not myself. I have to fess up about that, but I have spoken to quite a few of the actors, some of the advisors, and of course, Nick himself was there too. So what I thought it'd be useful to do was to look at the categories of good cop, bad cop, and things to think about for next year. And so I'll start off with the optimistic stuff, which is, what was good about this Conference of the Parties meeting number 26 for Africa. And I think the broad feeling was that holding the event itself, a mass event and mass in-person event, was an achievement. We have to give that to the UN, the Scottish government, and the English government, is it? The characters in Westminster, that even pulling it off was an achievement. And it did, not as much as we all would have wanted, get the civil society groups, the pro climate lobby fully involved as far as could be possible, and that was seen as a great achievement. I think there's a lot of concern in Africa that the climate change concerns have been couched so much as a kind of rich world issue that is not relevant for Africa and is just a distraction for the developmental imperatives of Africa, and not actually something that could destroy those developmental imperatives. So I think getting back to the spirit of Rio, some people talked about, of 1992, and it's 30 years ago, but the feeling is that that this is part of the process of bringing climate back into the mainstream of international politics and policy around the world, and that should go right across Asia, Africa, Latin America, as well as Europe and North America. So that's seen as positive. That happened, and there was at least some acceptance. And also, one of the themes of our conference was demographics as well as security and climate change. And the point that African delegates hammered home again and again is, you're talking about China and India, the big mega economies and mega populations of Asia. Don't forget, by 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people. Lagos will be the third biggest city in the world, and those people will need energy. So it's all very well to talk about the energy crisis in China and India and getting people off coal, et cetera, but what is going to happen to Africa's current dependence on fossil fuel and indeed forests for basic heat, cooking fuel and so on. So I think those points got a lot more salience and relevance and profile in the meeting. So that was seen as positive. And the next positive point is slightly barbed, in the sense was not so many things were not achieved at COP26. It's made COP27, which is in Africa, which is in Egypt, much more important. So it's particularly the level of awareness and the sort of the crisis mode that the international system is in over climate means the reporting on nationally determined contributions to bringing down the emissions, those are going to be made on an annual rather than a sort of a 5-yearly basis and so on. So that makes the meeting in Egypt much more important for all those things, both for the big issue about mitigation, but also for the issues which many African states have felt underplayed, such as adaptation. So it's Cairo will be an opportunity, or I think it's Sharm el-Sheikh they're going to hold it in. So the Egyptian hosting of COP should be an opportunity. Of course, Comfort will get on later to issues such as the politics of the Greater Horn of Africa, which there is this tricky matter of Ethiopia's grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and Egypt's attitude to that. But for the moment, I think there's optimism, and that will galvanize Africa's regional organizations, the African Union, the African Development Bank, and the Economic Commission for Africa, to focus very much on this Cairo meeting. So I think it will raise the policy activity and consciousness about that. I think getting into the specifics, South Africa's $8.5 billion coal for climate swap was seen as tremendously important, not just for the money. It's well less than a third, probably a quarter of what is needed to get South Africa off coal. But as a template for doing things, the way in which the South Africans put the entire deal together and then took it around the Western financing houses and governments as a project that needed the money. And surely, you know, if you're serious about climate, you have to back this. And so did the diplomatic work, the number crunching and everything before they took it round. And that was seen as the sort of thing that African states are going to be doing a lot more of to make their case. So a proactive pushing of African-led solutions to the particular national and regional issues that they face. So I think the South African deal was seen as hugely important. There's also the belief that in these tricky negotiations between countries that are really dependent on fossil fuels, both for their energy industry, but also for their export earnings, countries like Algeria, Nigeria, Angola in particular, that they'll get some sort of recognition of that. There was a debate. There was nothing in the final statement giving a recognition of that, but country delegations said that they felt that they had got their points across. They're also looking to the fact that the G20 will be hosted by Indonesia next year. Indonesia is, of course, a big oil producing and gas producing country, so it has its own concerns about what a just energy transition is. So I think there's a sense, and that was made very much by the Nigerian delegation, that there needs to be a clearer definition of what just energy is and what it means, and how countries historically, like Angola and Nigeria, for whom fossil fuels contribute a massive amount of the economy, need to be brought into the calculus. Now, there's out of the COP meeting, there were a group of policymakers who were debating whether Africa should even engage in the pledges on emissions, but in fact should rather come up with its own plan through the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Area for a kind of a Green New Deal for Africa, and just say, look, this is the continent that everyone should be focusing on. These are our imperatives. Help us fund it. So sort of taking the South African project on a continental scale. So those were some of the more positive ideas. And I guess I just referred to the earlier on the finance issue, which the African Union negotiators led by the Gabonese energy minister pressed a lot on. They didn't get what they wanted, but what they did get was an acceptance of the growing importance of adaptation measures in Africa, which have been incredibly important in terms of rising sea levels, but also in terms of changing crop technologies and agricultural technologies in general, and the cost of that, and the cost of adapting to drought and extreme weather and so on. And that got onto the agenda. And I think there was this clause about, I think 5% of carbon trading should be allocated to adaptation for developing countries. So there was a recognition of that special demand. I'll just be as fast as I can on the bad stuff, of which there was a fair bit, unfortunately. So the feeling was that there was great disappointment over the climate finance and the fact that the meeting didn't even get to the 100 billion this year, and skepticism about the mechanisms for monitoring those future contributions and so on, and also about the mechanisms within the 100 billion that has been agreed, given that African states get such a low percentage of the 100 billion, or historically have had such a low percentage of the target 100 billion. So some of those are technical issues about how to improve the access to financing, but some of those are about the rules and regulations. And the Gabonese minister was pressing very, very hard for a clear monitoring mechanism to understand, so it can be understood within all the organizations that are contributing to managing and raising that 100 billion, how that is being parceled out around the world, and that it should be parceled out a lot more equitably. So that was one point. The other big point on financing was the arguments about loss and damage, which are kind of, sound like the legal jargon of it, that how much damage has climate change already done to economies, developing economies, especially around the world, and how can that be compensated, given the oft-quoted figure that of cumulative carbon emissions, Africa has contributed the grand total of 3.8%, yet as a continent suffers the greatest amount of loss and damage from climate change. So that there was another disappointment. This is again slightly double-edged. Mark Carney came up with $130 trillion under management assets available to go green, and so people are saying great. But where are the structures? Where are the transfer mechanisms? We're not just talking about a bit of extra money for the African Development Bank or the World Bank's Africa Department. We're talking about a massive international financing effort that the market has not got the mechanisms of meeting, nor has the public sector sort of multilateral system got it. So there's great concern about that. Allied to that, the $650 billion special drawing rights reserves from the IMF. There was meant to be some sort of negotiation at the G20 prior to COP26. No agreement was reached on that. So that would offer a large wad of money for climate change adaptation and just energy transition programs. No progress on that. So that was a great concern. Also, in the final document, no mention of nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. And that's all about what Africa is doing, both in terms of countries like Gabon and Democratic Republic of Congo in terms of preserving the rainforests, but also in preserving biodiversity. And you've only got to look at Madagascar, which has the distinction of being a first country, sadly, to have a climate change induced famine, but is also one of the most greatest sources of biodiversity in the world. So, you know, balancing those two things, there wasn't enough recognition of that. And I think, yeah, just in terms of the latest figures we've got for the devastation of the Amazon in Brazil, it does make Africa's role as a preserver of rainforests and the carbon sink that offers the world all the more important. So I think that's so on the bad side of the ledger, that's what I'd end up with.
Patrick, thank you so much for that lightning tour of some really, as you say, some good and some bad, which leaves quite a lot for next year's COP27. Let me pass over to Comfort, because one of the important points of our conference was the impact that is already being felt in Africa from climate change and how this is impacting on the social, economic, and political situation. Could you give us an update, please, on how things have evolved in the light of COP26 from your point of view? Comfort.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I won't make a confession like Patrick did, because you told me to look at the ground realities, which meant, you know, that I'm traveling through the Sahel, through the Horn of Africa, looking deep at the ground and talking to my colleagues. So those are our correspondents in contrast to Patrick's correspondence. Just for the purpose of your audience, Nick, I wanted to say that one area that we spotlighted in the conference that we co-hosted with you, Nick, and the Africa Confidential. One area that we spotlighted was on how to better link climate change to conflict and to understand climate change's impact on conflict, also to understand the impact of conflict on climate change. And it would not be a surprise to many of you in the audience, and we sort of predicted it ourselves, Nick, Patrick, that it was probably too late to get this topic firmly inserted into the agenda, and that our goal was then to try and discuss it, have it discussed at the sidelines of Glasgow. But our work between now and COP27 was to make sure that it was placed firmly on the agenda in Cairo, where I think a number of African countries will certainly see the relevance of why there's a clear link between the two. I mean, in a nutshell, you know, our message from the conference is that climate change is an actorless threat, and we see that very clear on the continent. The link between, as I said, the link between conflict and security was not on the agenda. But yet it's an important part of the equation. If you're going to deal seriously in a meaningful way with climate change, it's very hard to ignore its impact on conflict as well. And you know, one of the things that we tried, for the benefit of the audience, before I get into the specifics of the Sahel on the Horn, one of the things that we tried to do in the conference was to show the substantial, or to give substantial examples about the multiple pathways in which climate impacts conflicts, in terms, for example, of drought and flooding, in terms of displacement, in terms of competition over grazing land and fishing rights. All of these are live issues, whether it's in the Sahel, in Nigeria specifically, or in the Horn of Africa as well. And I think one of the messages we tried to get across, certainly to those who are going into COP26, and Nick particularly made sure that this was placed on the agendas of all the key actors going up to Glasgow. They said that not to address the cost of conflict, or the link between climate and conflict, was to sort of miss an important part of the conversation. Patrick, to pick up on to continue your theme on the positives, some of the significant side events that took place at COP26 as well tried to focus attention on climate change risks to conflict as well. And also there was a strong community of climate security experts that did a lot of work in the lead up to COP26 to try and make the case for climate as well. I think one of the challenges that we face looking down the horizon is that it's going to be very difficult to get climate security conflict onto the agenda of COP27, given what we've seen already playing out at the Security Council, where there was an effort to try and get a resolution passed. Many of the major countries, and you saw those major countries and the sharp elbows that played out with them in Glasgow. So Russia, China, and India, for example, would prefer not to have climate change discussed as part of international peace and security. They prefer to see it as a developmental, environmental issue, because to add climate change onto the agenda of peace and security would further encroach, in their mind, further encroach on their sovereignty as well. So that's one concern. But on the ground, Nick, Patrick, one significant development that we didn't also really talk about at the conference, and I wanted to highlight for your colleagues today, is that even though it was very difficult to get the resolution passed at the Security Council, and even though it wasn't a top headline agenda item at COP26, we've seen a precedent set now in Somalia with the inclusion of a UN advisor on an environmental advisor being inserted into the UN mission in Somalia to help the UN mission think about its own climate footprint in Somalia, but also to help Somalians think through strategies and sort of programs to deal with the country's own climate vulnerability. And there are multiple climate security issues tied to their own herd of farmer challenges, tied to drought, tied to displacement, and tied to sort of various climatic shocks as well. Patrick, on your issue on adaptation, and this is where I think the rubber hits the road very, very clearly, if you don't include climate security, given the focus of climate adaptation, it is difficult to see how you achieve adaptation, given that half the countries that are affected by climate stress are also affected by conflict as well. So you have to ask yourself, how do you deal with the issues around mitigation on the ground where people are fighting? And if you can't deal with conflict as part of adaptation, it's going to be difficult to see how we move forward. So for example, in the Horn of Africa, in South Sudan, it's difficult to see how you can deal with adaptation in the context of instability there. I mean, you have a situation where people are moving into, because of the 2 years of drought and flooding, 2 years of climatic shocks, people are being forced to move from their homes, for example, from Jonglei into an armed conflict zone, such as the Equatorias as well. So it's 700,000 people, for example, Nick, today are being forced into the Equatorias region, the last holdout region, as you and Patrick know, that didn't sign the 2018 peace agreement leading to the peace deal in that country. So we've seen, a number of ethnic Dinka herders, for example, forced to the south of Equatoria. This is exacerbating strained relations between the Equatorians and Dinkas, and it's further aggravating pre-existing grievances. Patrick, you put the burden on me to deal with the most contentious geopolitical issue that is now grappling the Horn of Africa in the form of the Grand Renaissance Dam. Even before we can even discuss that, and even before we can think about how to reignite a diplomatic response to that geopolitical tension that locks in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, but also the wider region, we have to first deal with the sheer horror of the violent conflict that is taking place in northern Ethiopia in the form of Tigray, which is displacing over 1 million people. Moreover, 30, 40 years on, Patrick, when all of us were very focused and concerned and campaigning about famine in Ethiopia. Here we are 30, 40 years on, and we're now having to grapple with famine yet again in Ethiopia. The country's fate is on the brink of serious food insecurity, displacement already in a country that was already suffering from a humanitarian crisis, and now is facing a very turbulent situation with neighboring Sudan coming out of its own very difficult transition. Before we went into live session, Patrick, we were asking ourselves, what happens now with Sudan, with the coup, and a country that is facing a double whammy, the economic fallout before the economic difficulties of its transition, coupled with a very difficult situation over COVID and the economic fallout from COVID as well. And on top of that, you've got this real geopolitical tension between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, of course, seeing the Nile question as an existential threat. And the geopolitics and the proxy war now that we're seeing on the border with Sudan and Ethiopia, and how that's going to play out both at home in Ethiopia, that faces already multiple country threats, and also Sudan as well. So this is a very worrying time for us in the Horn, both in terms of the fragilities of the countries, but how each of their individual crises is spilling over into the region and complicating the picture in two countries that we saw as important anchors to stability in the Horn. And Nick, just one more point for me as a way, or two more points for me as a way of wrap up. When I think about the work that we have to do ahead of COP27, two of the most significant challenges for us is how, and they're represented in Nigeria and the Sahel. Both regions provide stark examples of the challenges ahead, especially in terms of how climate change pushes people further into precarious positions. So this is a region, Nigeria in its entirety, particularly the north of Nigeria, and then the Sahelian region. These are two regions that are facing a triple threat of resource competition over access to land, for example, demographic growth, which you and Patrick highlighted, and then the pressures and challenges of being able to operate in a global economy as well. So, for example, how these countries, and I think we need to place this on the agenda of COP27, in terms of mitigation and adaptation, how do you get these countries that do not have the necessary infrastructure, how do you get them to begin to manage the impact of climate change, especially in relation to the management, for example, of one big threat in the region, either management of the herder-farmer crisis, whether it's in Nigeria or in the Sahelian countries. The heart of the matter, Patrick, Nick, that I think we noted in our summary was governance as well, and working through the various levels, whether it's the local level, regional level, or national level, in working through how to think through about better governance and better management of the infrastructure in these countries as well. So as a way of summary, Nick, so what do we need to work on and think about ahead of COP27? Patrick, you put your heart on it in terms of money for adaptation. And without it, it's very difficult for us to begin to think seriously about how to get countries that are under severe conflict stress to begin to think about how to think about adaptation and clean energy. These are precious luxuries for a number of these countries to start grappling with. Nick, the other issue, as I've emphasized, is how to manage that impact of climate change. And then the financing, Patrick, that you talked about loss and damage as well. How do you begin to think through about that going forward into 2027, into COP 2027? I will end on a slightly optimistic note, Nick, and to say that although the developing countries did not necessarily get all they wanted, the door has been left open for us to think innovatively ahead of COP27 in terms of the urgent need to think through how to deal with the economic impact of COVID, the economic impact of dealing with that adaptation, but also how to use the offer of a dialogue to really think realistically about getting conflict-affected countries to think through about climate stress and also the economic impact to deal with mitigation and adaptation as well. I'll stop there, Nick. Thank you.
Comfort, thank you so much for that, again, brilliant lightning overview of where the situation now sits. I remind everybody that please use the Q&A function to put in any questions you'd like to pose on specific issues or general. We have some already. But before then, I'm delighted that we're joined by Lord Oates, the active participant in the APPG for Africa and a number of other groups in Parliament. And Johnny, can I pass the floor to you to raise some questions or make some comments? Please.
Sure. Thanks very much, Nick. And thanks, Patrick and Comfort, for such a comprehensive overview. That was so helpful. I'm here really to listen and to learn. And I do so with a number of hats on. Firstly, as the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Zimbabwe, and as Nick said, the vice chair of the Africa all-party group, but also as my own party spokesperson on the climate emergency and energy. I was talking with a Nigerian friend last week who's a medical doctor and works in the northern regions of Nigeria. And she was saying to me, you know, if the world wants to understand what happens if we don't take the action necessary to deal with climate change, then they need to come to Nigeria and see what is happening now. And Comfort obviously touched on many of those pressures, and particularly resource pressures. I really had a question for both panelists. Patrick mentioned the deal that South Africa brokered for sort of moving on from coal to new forms of generation. And I just wondered, I mean, obviously, South Africa is one of the wealthiest countries on the continent. It's got the capacity to put a deal together like this, and it's also got the diplomatic heft to deliver it. And this sort of plays into the issue that Comfort raised about not just climate exacerbating conflict, but conflict making it more difficult to tackle climate. And I just wondered if the panelists had views on you know, how similar kind of deals or perhaps different deals, but deals tackling with climate can be put together by countries involved in these sort of difficulties, and perhaps with less capacity. I mean, is there a role for regional blocks? How can these be put together so it isn't the countries which are comparatively wealthy already that are the only countries that benefit, but it can be more widely applied?
Thank you, Johnny. Patrick, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a very good point. And I think there was some, yeah, I mean, frustration, whatever, friendly rivalry between South Africa and some of the other countries of South Africa had gone ahead with this very much on a unilateral basis. But I think part of that was they had a very clear emergency, the national power utility. It was on the brink of falling apart. They needed at the same time to address that supply issue, but also kind of burnish their green credentials, because South Africa, probably along with Morocco, has done more on renewable energy than any other country on the continent. So for that reason, they've done it. What's happened since those talks at COP, and is happening as we speak, I think, there's a group in the African Union that are talking about how they bring together the African Continental Free Trade Area, African Development Bank, and the African Union to broker more such deals. And there is this, you know, it is a slogan, of course, but it, you know, there's an enthusiasm about putting together what they think will be a Green New Deal for Africa, and looking at several points where they could raise financing for such a transition. And the reason why I think you're dead right to talk about the regional dimensions of this is So if we look at the next 30 years of Nigeria's gas and oil exports, ditto Angola, ditto Algeria, if Europe says, oh, well, actually, we've got all the gas we can take from Vladimir Putin or any other source, and anyway, we're now against fossil fuels, as the European directors of the World Bank say they are. So what does Africa do with that? Well, it uses it regionally. I don't think, like Saudi Arabia, African governments are very keen to say, well, we'll just strand all these old assets, these historic assets, and never use them. Somehow they have to put together a transition. It should be a transition to green energy. But in the meantime, what are they going to use for energy? So it's that trade-off that, you know, the acceptance that, say, places like Nigeria and Algeria and Angola have already got gas industries, and they want to use that as a cleaner source of power than coal, for certain, but also as a transitional fuel, and getting the balance of that. And what can they do for other countries in the region as part of that? And one of the things that was said was, look, gas is a fossil fuel, obviously. The emissions are lower than coal, and they're a damn sight lower than chopping down forests and using wood as a cooking fuel. So, you know, those are the real world options at the moment. So I think, yeah, there are moves ahead. Are those three regional institutions in Africa to coordinate that sort of deals like South Africa. I think what South Africa has done is proved it's possible. And a lot of bankers were totally skeptical of this when the deputy finance minister said we talked about it at our conference actually, said about 3 months ago, well, I think we should just, if they want us to go to get rid of coal, fine, just give us $30 billion and we'll do it. You know, but at least it started the argument, and I think it is going to be followed up regionally. Yeah.
I think this energy transition is going to be an increasingly prominent part. Again, I think is going to be more heavily on the agenda.
Nick, one thing I would add as well is that, you know, Patrick said it was the urgency and the bilateral nature of South Africa's response. I also have to say that I think it's just very strategic on their part, and I think there ought to be a lesson to be taken by South Africa's own very, very focused, clear agenda, and a lesson for the rest of the continent, for other bigger or middle-ranked powers. I'm speaking here of Nigeria. I mean, to his credit, as you saw, Nick and Patrick, that the vice president from Nigeria had one single message coming into COP. It's a pity he himself wasn't at COP, but that focus on the equity, you know, and the need for a just and equitable response, I think is a message that we need to make sure carries through to COP27, and making sure that in what's missing, I think for the continent, Nick, Patrick, and we've bemoaned it on several occasions in relation to other things, is getting that common position articulated well by the continent. Who can do that for the continent? Who are the leaders that can do that for the continent? Are they national leaders, or can this be done through the AU? As you recall, the AU was supposed to agreed to the idea of getting an envoy. They still haven't worked that out. And could you get an envoy to articulate that just and equitable response? And maybe South Africa has laid down, I think, an important challenge for the continent to get its act together as well in its messaging for COP27.
Thank you, Comfort. I think that's a very important point, and particularly in relation to Nigeria, which has a lot of heft at the moment. It is not using as effectively as it could. But to achieve a just energy transition, there needs to be concrete proposals as to how we want to do it, and then as we see, the money can be mobilized to that initiative. We have now a number of questions from the audience, which I'd like to refer to. We have somebody anonymous who has said the African population will be increasingly urban, but much of the evidence on climate and conflict pathways comes from rural contexts. And I think that this is true. Is this a problem, and can we address it? I think there's quite a lot packed into that question. Comfort, would you like to discuss it, because the urbanization is a key trend across the whole of Africa. You're muted still. Yeah.
I mean, yes, urbanization is. I mean, this is the reality that we're living with on the continent as well. So there is the urbanization challenge. There's a demographic challenge and the pressures. You know, we heard your quote at the very beginning, Nick, Patrick, as well. But also there's a rural context, and the rural context speaks to the herder farmer challenge that we're seeing, whether it's in the Sahel. In fact, what binds the whole swerve, the Sahel into the Horn and down to East Africa and parts of Central Africa is this issue about pastoralism, you know, and how, you know, herders and farmers live together as well. This, I think, is a problem that we need to address, but it's not so much. I mean, the herder farmer challenge is not a new one, and you know, there have been various local strategies that have been put in place to navigate and manage their relationship. But I think it takes on a whole new meaning now because of the climate challenge, and that you're having various communities having to move southward in the sense of Nigeria, for example, encroaching on land. And Nigeria did come up with a credible solution in the form of its livestock implementation plan. The question is why it hasn't moved forward on that. The question also is that the various politics, that is Nigeria, the various non-reformers who are not interested in pursuing that livestock plan, Nick, because of what it would mean to their own ability to access various resources as well. The other challenge, as you know, is that in a number of these areas, you know, while the military, and it certainly speaks of the conflict in the Sahel, while the military, whether it's in the form of the UN or the French Operation Barkhane, has been successful in maybe pushing out the jihadists, the militants out of urban centers. Where have they pushed them into? They've pushed them into rural areas. What is happening in those rural areas? Now the militants are fighting and encroaching further into intercommunal tensions, historical intercommunal tensions. And when those tensions further flare up, it becomes another avenue for recruitment. And so you find, you know, rural communities now fighting on either side of the conflict, and then you have a cocktail of violence in the rural communities as well. So finding a way, again, in which to deal with, you know, the multiple pathways in which climate affects conflict, I think is going to be our challenge as we go forward into COP27. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, I think there's an important point there that from what you're saying, the impact of climate is accelerating urbanization, because it increases the uncertainty of agriculture and the insecurity in rural areas for the reasons you discussed. And people find towns safer, both in terms of somebody's going to give them some food, and secondly, they feel marginally more secure. So if anything, it's going to accelerate that trend and accelerate the trend of people moving, both within countries and beyond. It relates to the second question, and I'll put this to both of you, which is, you know, how do we define conflict? It's a very, this is a bigger existential question, but in fact, there's social conflict, you know, between generations, between different groups, and in fact, cultural conflict even, and even interpersonal conflict, as well as kind of obvious civil conflicts that we've got in Ethiopia and the challenges in Sudan. That's a big question, but if you have any thoughts on it, Comfort first, and then Patrick. Share them.
Says, what are we including in conflict, non-violent conflict, such as protest? I mean, I think one of the interesting developments in the last few years, and I remember it was Africa Confidential actually, who put a spotlight on what we would call non-violent protest. And, you know, we have to acknowledge that what happened in Sudan, for example, in 2019, you know, yes, there was deaths leading up to it, but in a sense, you know, there was a peaceful dimension also to that revolution, in taking over Bashir as well. You know, lessons learned also from Ethiopia, the way in which the transition happened in Ethiopia, that this was after 5 years of successive protests, youthful protests as well. We saw similarly in Zimbabwe, and we saw similarly in South Africa, this mountain crescendo of youthful sort of protests saying enough is enough and wanting to change the system of governance and the leaders as well. So I wouldn't necessarily call these conflicts. They become conflictual or deadly violent conflict when they are manipulated by various forces, military, for example, or other sort of militant groups or jihadists who are trying to exploit the disorder, exploit the grievances for various reasons. So you'll see it, for example, in Mozambique, where there are real genuine grievances, for example, in northern Mozambique, that are being exacerbated and exploited by various militant groups. These are long historical grievances as well. You'll see it also in the way it's played out in Nigeria, for example, the long-held grievances against police, peaceful process that we saw last year with the NSARS in Nigeria, that became violent because of the heavy-handed nature of the security responses, and also because there are other groups there who sought to exploit that as well. So there are non-violent ways in which to protest for change. And in climate change, we have seen very prominent activists come out to protest that. We saw that at COP26 here in Glasgow. And I think that what was very significant is the generational nature of that non-violent protests that were that's been taking place in the lead up to COP, and I expect to see it again in the lead up to COP27. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. And Patrick, in commenting on that, perhaps also it links to the next question from Miriam Krushnitsky about the role of civil society. And Sudan, as Comfort has said, is quite a good example of that. How can we increase the role of civil society, including in terms of access to climate finance during COP27, so civil society doesn't lose out even more? I mean, that's the role of civil society in COP27 is going to be an interesting challenge for the Egyptian government. Patrick.
Yeah, thanks. Right. I think on the definition of the conflicts that we're looking at, I mean, essentially, ultimately, whether they're resource conflicts, regional conflicts, in Ethiopia, they call it nationalities conflict. In other countries, they call it ethnic conflict. However you want to couch it, there has to be a political coming together for a political solution. No one believes that the forces of violence on either side are going to prevail unless there's some sort of political solution, discussion, whatever. So I think that's what it brings together. And what one of our speakers at the conference made very clear from Sudan was that a lot of the protests that you see, that you think are very local, about where roads go or about the shape of an irrigation project, essentially those are climate-related protests. They're a conflict over resources, but essentially they're informed by changing climatic conditions. And people saying, well, I can't farm here, I can't get access to that water or those seeds, and then protesting against the local authorities. And you're seeing more and more of that. So in terms of the traditional activism mediated through political parties, it seems to be sometimes quite quiescent, but actually opinion on the ground and activism on the ground across the continent is growing, but it's focused on these often local resource issues that still do need intervention of negotiators and mediators to get a political resolution. So I think that also gets into the Sudanese example, which Comfort spoke about and is so important, about what happened in Sudan, and in terms of having a national network of resistance committees that were not just a bunch of do-gooders, middle-class professionals with laptop computers, but were pharmacists, doctors, lawyers, even journalists, doing something useful, ensuring that people got access to medicaments, they got access now to sort of to affordable food, schooling for their children, and so on, and things like that. So I think the scope of activism in Sudan, but in many other countries across Africa, is growing. It's spreading out. It's way different from the kind of the civil society scene that we see in somewhere like London, for example, because it has to do so many more things. And because of that, it has a much greater root in the society and a much greater connection. That's why I think that the opposition in Sudan has been so successful in some ways in keeping its issues on the national agenda. So I think the question it really is, how can that be transferred into climate? And I think it's up to partly to the politicians and activists across the country. There are these networks, climate networks, green networks right across the continent. And they've got a great opportunity with Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt next year to use that as a focus. But as Nick said, or suggested perhaps, the current political climate in Egypt is not particularly friendly towards civic activism. You could say is damn right hostile. So I think that is going to be a tension, and it's to me, from a purely organizational point of view, it's a strange choice, to locate a conference where civil society action is going to be so critical in a country that's got a government with a record of hostility to that sort of action.
Let's hope it will have an impact in Egypt as well as continent-wide. But there's an interesting comparison here with Tunisia, where again you had very active civil society engaged, but once they were influential in government, it proved very difficult to deliver what the civil society and the public have been expecting. And I think that reinforces the fact that for democratic countries, we should be doing more to support these, and including through climate finance when there's an opportunity. In the last few minutes, I'm just going to take the last three questions, which in some ways link, from Martine Dennis. Apart from Gabon, has another African country managed to access climate finance? And if not, why? And this was a point that was highlighted at our conference, how hard it is for Africans to get access to that climate finance. And then Mariama Kamara from Smiling Through Light, which provides clean energy in Sierra Leone, is again, how can we get African voices more clearly heard? They're sitting there, but when they speak, are they really being listened to? And finally, from Julian Eaton at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, that we know African people are disproportionately suffering the effects of climate change, but people don't identify that as the cause. And is there a role for better public education on this to enable them to say, actually, the fact that we've had a flood, that we've had a drought, I want my government to do more about climate change. That might help them raise their voices even more. So can I, in just your closing comments, please, for both of you, if you address one or all of those questions, and then I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up. But Comfort, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nick. And I will do with the last two from Miriama and Julian as well. I mean, as I said, I think this is probably the first time, and there seems to be kind of like a growing crescendo of making sure there is the more civil society voices are heard. And even in the lead up to COP26, there have been multiple conversations, whether they were satisfactory or whether they garnered enough attention. I think we still have to do that assessment. Certainly, the reason why our organizations came together was because we felt that the Africa voice needed to be amplified, and we hope that we contributed to that. But more importantly, because it was heading towards Africa, we used this conference as the beginning of that mobilization to make sure that when it does go to Africa, that we really are able to own and direct and shape that conversation. And it's in that spirit that I think we'll hope to see more of Africa's voices being heard. Certainly a youthful voice being heard in the lead up to COP27. Julian, on your question, I think one of the biggest challenges going forward for me is the work that we need to do in getting everybody or policymakers to better understand the link between climate change and conflict. Certainly, part of the problem is that multilateral institutions themselves have sort of been too slow to pick up on the emerging trends. Another, I think, is that experts, I put myself in there, but I put others. I mean, I'm learning as I go along, but even other experts in the field have not necessarily yet found a way to convince these institutions and various leaders that there is a problem, that there is clearly a link between conflict and climate change, and how they can help in doing that. But we're seeing we're beginning to see a change. And as I said to you in the lead up to COP26, climate scientists really did make took significant undertaking to better educate people about the link between, or the multiple pathways in which climate becomes an impact to conflict as well. And I think also researchers themselves are making general assessments themselves between climate and conflict. But today, improved forecasting makes it possible to give a more precise accounting of where climate disasters will manifest and how local, regional, and international actors should react to that as well. And hopefully by COP27, that we will see a dramatic improvement in how forecasting can help policymakers make better understanding of most of the urgent climate-related threats in many conflict affected parts of the world, and the huge swings, particularly, for example, in water availability, the Horn being the most critical. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Comfort. I think you're absolutely right. Scientists have had a real major impact here, and it has changed public opinion. We certainly see that in the West, and I think we could begin. What we need to see is the finance following the science.
Yeah.
Patrick, your last comment.
Yeah, I mean, on the finance, one strategy that would work pretty well, and I think you're seeing it as the international infrastructure, ecosystem, whatever, of civil society organizations reconfigures itself. That is, they no longer want the sort of Western outfits running around Asia and Africa and Latin America. They're getting much more discreet. They're forming national organizations much more that will use funding from a range of sources and giving them more national and regional legitimacy. And one of the targets, obviously, are the big corporations. And you're seeing increasingly in civil society in Africa, people sort of hitting on the big companies and saying, look, this is an area where you could be engaged. You don't have to take on a military government in Sudan or wherever, but you can input into a national cause. I think climate fits in that very well. So, and you're seeing this with civil society operations, talking to people like Dangote, like Strive Maziwa has done a lot on the health issues, and saying, put your corporate heft behind this, put some money in it, and help us campaign and lobby. And also on the bigger financial question, if we're looking at this massive transfer of resources into a Green New Deal for Africa, it is going to be trillions, not billions. And who better to talk to get that going than some of the big corporates in Africa that will be kind of the conduits of this money. So it seems to me that if the civil society organizations and on climate at least can work with the big corporates in Africa, you've got a chance of getting some of this money out there into some of these projects. So I think it could be quite a positive development if it can come off, and maybe next year we'll see some signs of that happening.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed. And Johnny, would you just like to say a few last words on behalf of the APPG of Zimbabwe?
Well, really, just first of all, to thank you, Nick, and Hoda, and everybody at the Royal African Society for organising events like this. And of course, particular thanks to Comfort and Patrick for, as I said, their sort of comprehensive overview and really interesting insights. For me, it was highly informative, and really these sort of things are invaluable, I think, to those involved in politics and policy to understand the issues better from the ground up. So really, thank you to everybody who's taken part. Thank you for organising it. I hope there will be these sorts of events going on in the future, because I think we really need to continue to understand and develop our understanding better of the impacts, and also what we should be arguing to do about them. So thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you, Johnny. And I think some important conclusions, certainly a lot of information from both of you, Patrick and Comfort. Thank you both. This has been recorded, so it will be available on our website if you want to spread it more widely on your networks, because I know not everybody who wanted to be here could be here. So it will be up very shortly, and then please go to our website with the event, and you can then copy the recording more widely. But thanks to everybody, and our audience as well, some great questions. Johnny, Patrick, Comfort, thank you all so much. And we will certainly keep up the briefings on this in the future, Johnny. So, our best wishes to all of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Nick, and to your audience.